There is a place that no longer exists, not because time erased it, not because the desert swallowed it, but because heaven looked down and decided that what stood there had no right to continue standing. At their peak, the most prosperous on earth. Today, nothing. Not a stone. Not a name carved into rock. Not a trace that they were ever real. And yet the ground where they once breathed still holds. Something ancient, a kind of silence that feels like a warning. This is not a myth. This is not a legend invented to frighten children. This is the record of what happens when a civilization decides it answers to no one. The valley, that looked like paradise long before the fire came. There was only beauty. After the great scattering at Babel, when God fractured the one language into many and the nations were dispersed like seeds in wind, certain clans moved south and east until they found a valley so fertile it seemed God had forgotten to close the garden gate. The Jordan Plain, green without effort, wet without rain, rich without work. The descendants of Canaan, a people hardened by displacement, arrived there and saw not a gift, but an opportunity. There is a difference between gratitude and ambition, and they chose ambition. They did not ask who made the valley. They simply decided it was theirs. They built with a ferocity that impressed even their enemies. Sodom rose first, a city of angular stone walls, broad commerce roads, and channels that pulled river water through the cities. Veins like a living body, towers, markets, granaries stacked to the roof. Within 2 generations, it had become what every wandering caravan called the same thing, the city of cities. Then Gomorrah, its sister, its shadow, its mirror image, grew up in the south. If Sodom was built for power, Gomorrah was built for pleasure. Its architecture was softer, more ornate. Its streets curved where Sodom's were straight. Its temples were perfumed, draped in colored cloth, and filled every night with musicians, wine, and the kind of festival that begins as celebration and ends as something else entirely. Together, they became the twin centers of an entire civilization. 5 cities in the plain, with Sodom and Gomorrah as their twin thrones, trade routes bent toward them. Merchants rerouted weeks of travel just to pass through their gates, because the wealth there was real. The food was extraordinary. The entertainment was incomparable, and slowly, invisibly, the rot began. What prosperity does to a people with no fear of God there is a pattern in history that repeats so consistently it almost feels like a law. Abundance, unchecked by humility, becomes poison. It did not start with violence. It rarely does. It started with small permissions. Who decides what is right and wrong? We are free here. Our city, our rules. The philosophers debated it in the open squares. The priests institutionalized it inside the temples. The kings protected it with law, and the people, drunk on comfort, applauded every step of the descent. The sins of Sodom and Gomorrah were not one thing. They were many. Scripture lists them with uncomfortable specificity. Pride, excess of food, careless ease, failure to help the poor. And beneath all of it, a sexual culture so inverted, so severed from its original design, that what God placed in human nature as a sacred covenant between man and woman had been systematically dismantled, mocked, and replaced with appetite without limit or direction. Men pursued men, not quietly, not privately, but publicly, brazenly, as policy. Strangers who passed through the city gates did not find hospitality. They found predators. The ancient law of host and guest, one of the oldest moral codes in the world, was weaponized. Welcome to Sodom meant something very different from what the words implied. The people did not simply sin. They celebrated their sin. They institutionalized it. They taught it to their children as freedom. The judges of the city had stopped punishing wickedness. They punished anyone who objected to it. Righteousness became the crime. Restraint became weakness, and the voice of God, still speaking, still available to those willing to listen, was silence beneath the noise of a culture that had confused license with liberation. The man who chose the view over the destination, name was Lot, his uncle was Abraham, the man to whom God had spoken directly, the man who had walked with the Almighty through covenant and promise, and Lot, who had grown up under that covering, who had absorbed enough of that faith to be called righteous by God himself. Lot looked at the Jordan Plain and Medethi, single worst decision of his life. He chose with his eyes. There had been tension. Abraham's herds and Lot's herds had grown large enough to compete for the same land. Abraham, with the generosity that defined him, offered Lot first choice: go left or right, and I will take the other direction. Lot looked left, he looked right, and there, shimmering in the afternoon sun, was the valley. And in the valley, Sodom, beautiful from a distance, prosperous from a distance, orderly from a distance. He did not ask God, he did not pause. He chose Dot at first. He pitched his tents near the city, just near, just the edge, just close enough to trade. But proximity has a gravity of its own. Soon he was inside the city, then inside its systems, then sitting at its gate as a judge, which means he had become, by all social definition, one of its leaders. He had not converted to wickedness, but he had made peace with it. He had built his life inside it, and his daughters grew up in Sodom, not visiting it, not passing through it, in it, breathing its air, walking its streets, absorbing its values the way children absorb everything, through proximity, through repetition, through the slow assumption that whatever surrounds you is simply how the world is. The cry that reached the throne there is a phrase in the ancient text that should stop every reader cold. The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grievous. A cry as if the earth itself was screaming from beneath the weight of what was being done upon it, as if every act of violence, every perversion of the sacred, every victim silenced by the city's machinery of appetite, all of it had accumulated into a sound that traveled upward, past the valley, past the sky, past every distance, and landed in the presence of God. He heard it. He responded. Before the judgment came, God appeared to Abraham in human form, accompanied by two others. They sat, they ate, they spoke of the coming child to be born to Sarah. And then, as they rose to leave, God paused because Abraham was not just a subject, he was a friend, and a friend deserves a warning. What followed was one of the most astonishing negotiations in all of Scripture. Abraham, a man made of dust, stood before the Eternal and began to bargain, not for himself, but for a city full of strangers who mostly despised everything he stood for. What if there are 50 righteous? 40, 20, 10. Each time, God agreed. Each time, Abraham pressed further, that famous voice growing quieter and more uncertain with each number. He stopped at 10 because he could not. Imagine the situation was that bad. He was wrong. The two messengers descended into Sodom at evening. The city was alive with its ordinary horror, and Lot, sitting at the gate in his capacity as judge, saw them, and something in him recognized that these were not ordinary travelers. He bowed. He begged them to come to his house. He was insistent in a way that, perhaps, only a man who knew exactly what this city did to strangers could be insistent. They accepted. The door had barely closed when the mob arrived. Every man in the city, young and old. They surrounded the house completely and made their demand without shame, without disguise, without a single attempt at subtlety. They wanted the strangers. They wanted them for the same reason Sodom had always taken what it wanted, because it believed it could. Lot went outside. He closed the door behind him and placed himself between the mob and the guests under his roof. What he said next, the offer of his own daughters, has disturbed readers for centuries, and rightly so. It was a failure, a desperate, culture-contaminated failure from a man who had lived too long inside a place that traded in bodies. But the mob rejected even that. They wanted what they wanted, and then they turned on Lot himself. That was the moment the messengers acted. The door opened. Lot was pulled inside, and the men of Sodom, every single one of them, were struck blind. Not dimly, not partially, completely. They groped the air for a door they could no longer find, and eventually they gave up and went back to their homes. To sleep, unaware that they had just been given, without knowing it, their final night. Mercy wears urgency on its face. That was the instruction. Take your wife, your daughters, anyone who belongs to you, and run. Do not look back. Do not stop on the plain. Get to the mountains, and do not look back. Lot hesitated. The text says it plainly. He lingered. After everything, even now, even with fire on its way, some part of him was reluctant to leave. So the angels did something extraordinary. They took him by the hand, him, his wife, his two daughters. They physically led them out of the city because God's mercy. For this one man was strong enough to override his paralysis. They ran as the sky began to pale at the horizon. Then it came. The text calls it fire and sulfur falling from the sky. Not a metaphor, not a literary device. The cities and their surrounding plains, every building, every marketplace, every temple, every alley, everything that grew in the ground, consumed completely. The smoke of the destruction rose like the smoke of a furnace, and Abraham, standing at the same high place where he had pleaded the night before, saw it from a distance and understood that 10 righteous people had not been found, and Lot's wife, whose name we were never given, which may itself be part of the tragedy, looked back. One turn, one glance, perhaps grief, perhaps disbelief, perhaps the kind of attachment that forms when you have built a life somewhere, even the wrong somewhere, for long enough. She looked. She became a pillar of salt, a monument of warning at the edge of a landscape that had just been unmade. She had left Sodom physically, but some part of her had never left at all. What survives the judgment? Lot and his daughters reached Zoar then. Driven by a fear that even the small city couldn't contain, they fled again up into the mountains, into a cave. 2 young women who had grown up in Sodom, whose fiancés had laughed at the warning, whose mother had turned into salt behind them, whose father sat in the dark of a cave, shattered and sleepless. What happened next in that cave is among the most disturbing passages in Scripture, not because it was hidden, but because it was the logical conclusion of something that had begun long before the fire fell. The daughters, formed by Sodom's logic, concluded that the world had ended and that ordinary morality no longer applied. On successive nights, they intoxicated their father and conceived children by him. They named those children Moab and Benami. From them came the Moabites and the Ammonites, nations that would spend generations in active antagonism toward Israel, nations that would carry, in their founding story, the precise moral inversion that had defined the cities where their mothers were raised. Sodom was destroyed. But what Sodom had planted in the people who escaped it, the habits of thought, the definitions of permissible, the instincts formed by years of immersion, those traveled with them into the cave, into the next generation. Into history, you can escape a city. You cannot automatically escape what the city made of you. This is the lesson the story refuses to let end cleanly. There is no triumphant escape. There is a man who survived by grace, a wife who became a monumento misplaced longing, and 2 daughters who carried Sodom's values into the future inside their own bodies. The fire consumed the buildings. The salt preserved the warning. But transformation, real, interior transformation, is the only thing that truly escapes judgment. And Lot's family, despite everything, had not yet found it. The ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah have been sought by archaeologists for centuries. Some believe they have found them. Others dispute every candidate site. What is certain is this: the geography of the Jordan Plain holds, even now, a strange desolation, where the ancient records say flourishing once stood, but the location is almost secondary to the question. The story keeps asking the question it was preserved to ask across every generation that has ever read it. What are you building? What are you allowing? Who are you surrounding yourself with? And what is it making you into? Sodom did not fall in a single catastrophic moral collapse. It fell the way most things fall, gradually, then suddenly, permission by permission, silence by silence, until the cry that rose from the earth was louder than any voice still willing to speak. Truth inside it, the fire came from outside, but the conditions for the fire had been built, stone by stone, from the inside. That is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it has never stopped being relevant.